Nice. Give folks about another minute and a half. While folks are getting comfortable, I wanted to introduce our team today. For those who have known me and seen me, again, hello, I am Nastasia Moore, C4's training and technical assistance person, also providing some targeted training and TA to HUD's federal partners. With me today is my amazing colleague and friend, Monique Price. And Monique, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be in community with you today. My name is Monique Price, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm joining you all the way from Connecticut. And I am the Race Equity Subject Matter Expert Manager 2 for C4. And I am delighted, again, as I said, to be in community with all of you today.
Now, me and Monique are not the only ones running the show. We could not make this possible without one of our other colleagues who will be behind the scenes and in front of the scenes today, Genesis Garcia. Genesis, do you want to tell us who you are and where you're coming from?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Genesis Garcia. I'll be here in the room today. So if you do have any questions with regards to tech or anything, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'll be in the chat putting some more conversation items in there as well. And I'm a project coordinator for C4, she, her pronouns, and happy to be here with you today.
Nice. All right, so let's get into what we covered last time to give some context. So Daryl and I were able to facilitate some really good conversation about why lead with race, why we center race equity in these spaces, painting a picture of the historical context of housing and homelessness and how that has played out from way back then up until this point. And then we talked about understanding anti-racism language. And so we wanted to get into some shared understanding about different race equity and anti-racism concepts, such as racism, race, more specifically white privilege, what it looks like to utilize a racial equity lens, talking about why equality isn't enough. And so what we want to do is we want to continue building upon that framework into this second session. This second session, we will get into understanding the three levels of racism and the means in which they operate and how they function throughout your work. I think really important last time folks had brought up, and how does this apply back to the COC? And how does this apply back to our homeless networks? We're going to be diving into how those levels of racism impact your homeless services, how those levels of racism impact your COC in general, as well as in general as we just live throughout each system. We're going to describe in which ways racial bias. And so when we talk about the three levels of racism, we're going to get to an interpersonal, personal piece of racism. So really looking in and within ourselves and describing and talking about how racial bias affects Black, Indigenous people of color. I think, Peter, you had mentioned this earlier. You want to gain some sense of what folks of color experience and some understanding around maybe how some of that bias plays out. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to tie up this session with identifying next steps to promote equity within your personal and professional networks. We're going to do some breakout groups. We're going to do some interactive mural exercises. As last time, you all really drive these facilitation and discussions. And so we're really counting on you for either, popcorning in or coming off mute to speak. It's all highly welcomed. And then we do have spaces where you can be more anonymous. You can DM or private message myself, Monique, or Genesis, and we will do our best to respond to you promptly throughout the session. Okay, so as last time, we have to come to some agreements, right? So when having difficult conversations, we have to, stay engaged. We want to make sure that folks who do experience some discomfort in having difficult conversations around race and racism feel supported in the space. We talked last time about feeling somewhat, for those of you who do feel uncomfortable, it's okay, because why? We have to become somewhat uncomfortable to become more comfortable, engaging in what it means to promote race equity, speaking your truth. If you know me, I said this before, we're throwing out all the political mess today. All the time, folks want to be so politically correct in these spaces, but what happens is we're always politically correct in these spaces and nothing is accomplished. And so I ask that folks speak their truth. You throw out the political mess today, and for the rest of the 2 sessions we have left, and really, speak what's on your mind as appropriate. What we're doing here is we are not creating a safe space. We don't believe in safe spaces, but we do believe in liberated spaces. And so speaking your truth, providing this liberated platform for you to speak, respectfully and appropriately is more than welcomed. Something that Genesis reminds us all the time is that whatever folks say is we're taking it as a first draft. It's something that we can continue to work on and tailor as education around these concepts grow. And then, as always, accept non-closure. What do we mean by that? We will not, the subject matter expert, Miss Monique, will not have all the answers today. I don't have all the answers today. If we had all the answers, this wouldn't be happening. I mentioned this before, the people that came way, way before us, they didn't have all the answers either. And so this is an iterative process. And so we have to continue to engage in the most equitable solutions to disrupt systems that perpetuate inequalities that best fit you all's community needs. Okay, with all of that being said, if you all are in agreement and ready to go, give me some energy. Yes, I'm in agreement, I'm ready to go. Give me some reactions, some thumbs up, all of that. We also welcome folks to come on camera. It feels like it makes the experience a lot better in this space. Though Monique, myself, and Genesis, we're a people person, we'd rather be in a room and looking at you. And so this is the only way we can feel you, look at you, and get a sense of where you are. So feel free to join us on camera. If you don't want to join us on camera, that's okay too.
Thank you, Anastasia. That was a lot, but I think you set the groundwork for us to get ready to dig into our conversation today. And so, as she said, feel free to turn that camera on. If there's something that resonates with you, type something in the chat when we're going throughout our journey together today. We're on a journey. That's what we're on a journey. And so understanding that we're on a journey, we're going to talk about understanding the levels of racism. And I want you to understand that there is levels to this, right? And whether we choose or not to accept or agree with it, racism does not, in fact, exist without having these multiple levels. And so today we're going to take the time to walk you through some of those levels, and that we understand at every level, each of us have a role to play, and sometimes perpetuating some of those racist practices throughout those systems. That's why we'll talk about a little later, interrogating it all. And so as we walk through the levels of racism today, we're going to talk about systemic racism, educating us on how systemic racism is normalized, legitimized by an array of social factors, right? Society does it, including, we've already talked about some of the historical, the culture, the ideologies of institutions and policies that have left routinely people of color at a disadvantage, right? And those who have privilege at more of an advantage to advance throughout society. We'll give you a snapshot of how institutional racism occurs within institutions and systems of power, and what those systems of power are, so that way we can think about where are there some unfair policies that have been discriminatory practices that people experience still today. And then think about how it's applicable to the COC level and what it is you can begin to do to create change and transform the communities that you all work in. And we'll look at those inequitable outcomes, for folks of color, because in order for us to move past the problem, we have to fall in love with the problem. And I say that often, that you want to fall in love with the problem. If you always think about, let's go straight to the solution, you're missing that thing in the middle of the problem and the solution, which is called the process. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. And then after that, we're going to really think about the interpersonal racism piece. And that is what occurs when you have individuals interacting. What are those experiences like? And we're going to explore that and how implicit and explicit bias occurs within our workplace, within our interactions with our clients, so that way we can begin to mitigate those by addressing them, by leaning into them, by calling them out and making sure that we are doing our part as we look at these levels of racism to address them one by one. And we know that, Nastasia mentioned, we didn't end up in this predicament overnight. So it's going to require some work for us to be able to move forward. So in thinking about that work, let's start with understanding a layer of racism, the systemic racism piece. And so although there are no explicit federal governmental laws and policies that promote race and racial discrimination like Jim Crow and slavery did, systemic racism still exists today. If we in our minds do not acknowledge that, then we are doing ourselves a disservice. It acknowledges today and exists in other forms. Some of them are underlying that are not as obvious, but there are some more that are more like out front and in your face. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly the way that it was designed to keep people segregated, to keep people of color to have less access. And we'll talk about that today. In the next few slides, we discuss how systemic racism still occurs today. Understanding that where you live often determines your access to employment, your access to housing and healthcare, your access to equitable housing and healthcare. These are the things that prevent us from having those opportunities in society. So racism shows up. You may say, well, how does it show up today? I really don't understand. It shows up in the wealth gap. It shows up in employment. It shows up in society. It shows up across institutions. And so as we think about this today, remember that these were all driven by segregation and the imagery of how white and Black people were viewed. Think about even when you hear the word white or Black, what are some of the things that are associated with it? You hear the word Black as the color, you're like, oh, that's angry. It's dirty, right? When we often hear the word white, we think about, oh, it's pure, it's purity. So even from those small instances, as we look at them, think about those are some of the things that have contributed to some of the layers of racism. And what I want you to remember is that systemic racism knows no boundaries, and every system needs interrogating. And when you think about interrogating the system, if you could go back to that, the system, systemic racism has no boundary side, please. I want you to think about the system from the perspective of who's benefiting from this? Who's benefiting from the policies that are being created? Then think about who's being harmed in the process. Who are we hurting? Who are we leaving out? And then begin to think about how can you begin to assess the people who have been left out and create opportunities, which will be critical, right? When you have those critical conversations, to bring them to the table and allow them to create the table so that you can get a full, clear understanding of what their experience is and validating that experience and not minimizing how they are experiencing the system. And so those systems that we're talking about are education, state and government, political leadership, healthcare, law enforcement, the justice system. These are often systems where people get left out. And I know that this is where we left off last time, even though I wasn't in the virtual room. I know that this is where we left off. And we want to make sure that we go deeper in this conversation today. So the question that I have for you is, what systems have perpetuated inequities with your clients? And if anybody wants to open up and share something in the chat or hit that unmute button, we welcome you to bring your voice in the space. And I'm gonna ask again and put it in the chat, but what systems have perpetuated inequities with your clients?
Education system.
Anybody, you want to expound on that? In what way?
That for children, I mean, this is the way we get our start in the world. And so the educational resources that are provided to low income and communities of color are off from the very beginning and continue all the way up through college. And so since in this society, education often can help drive your financial success and personal wealth, then therefore you are every day, the schools continue to operate the way they're operating. They are continuing to maintain the gap in outcomes for white people and people of color.
Alex, people give, I like it when we give folks some energy. Absolutely. One of the things when I think about this, the educational piece, is when we talked about history, the education piece ties back to where folks of color could get education based on where they live. Also, when I think about the education piece, I think about what's not being taught in the education systems that contribute to what we are seeing and experiencing today, which is why folks who don't look like me are clueless that this stuff even exists. And when I say this stuff, let me name with precision and be more explicit, which is why folks want to ignore or choose to ignore that race and racism is still a big deal in society, and that Black and brown folks experience it every single day. So the education piece is wonderful, and I appreciate you for bringing it up, Alex.
And if I may, Nastasia, I was
Yes.
I was lucky enough to be on a call with the author of Color of Law, Richard Rothstein, and when someone asked, what can I do to help? He said, go to your schools and make sure that they are teaching how housing segregation existed, especially in Northern California, and help drive what exists today. He's like, if you do that, if kids start learning about how this came to be, that would make a big difference.
There you go. Absolutely.
Thank you, Alex. And I got to pull some things in from the chat, Nastasia.
Yeah.
There was a comment that said, and we need to really ask the hard question of how does our very homeless service system aimed at addressing these issues often perpetuate white dominance? And I promise you that we will have a conversation around white dominant and white dominant cultures, white dominant culture norms in our upcoming sessions. So you are definitely jumping all the way in, Jonathan, about how we continue to peel back these layers, because it's not enough to just say, what can we do? What can we do now to combat some of those things? And I see someone has a hand up. So I don't know, Jen, if we can unmute that person as well. It's label iPhone.
That me?
That's you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm Donna. I'm with the Winter Nights Family Shelter. I went up for the parking program. Actually, they're segregated, and their results are always uneven there too. Along with education, it would be digitally. The laws are different. They are treated differently. If you have the money, you can buy yourself out of it. If you don't, you can't. Stuff like that.
Thank
You know, absolutely. It goes to this comment here, if I can. I think it's pronounced Angel. Institutionalized racism is often evident as inaction in the face of need. Dr. Camera Phyllis Jones. And so you are on the right track, and I'm happy that you mentioned this, because we're going to spend some time talking about the impact of systemic racism, and that institutionalized piece is something we're going to dig into even deeper today, in dissecting how the institutions perpetuate that racism. So let's hold on to that. But I like that you bring that up. You're right where we want to be. Other examples.
And I want to make sure, and I see, Peter, I see
Yeah.
your hand. I want to jump in and say that even the question that was raised around the difference between systemic racism and systemic white supremacy, it is a distinct difference, right? Because one is through the system and one is the way it operates within the system. And this is exactly why we have to interrogate these systems. We have to interrogate these policies to make sure that we don't perpetuate it. So Peter, before I come back to you, I see James and Diane have their hand up. So I'm gonna go to you and then we'll go to Peter.
Hi. Yes, the other day we were meeting with the homeless and just taking information, because what we try to do through our organization is to get them in transitional housing. And I was watching how the African American, the Latinos had very little to no income, but anyone that was white had income. And I wasn't even understanding why they were homeless, but they had a great amount of income, couple of thousands compared to 300 or maybe 900 for the Latinos and the Blacks.
Thank you for sharing that. And then Peter?
Well, I'm coming at this from a kind of oddball place, but I think it is an example of institutionalization. I thought my career was going to be teaching high school, and back in 1968, I had my first experience of it at John F. Kennedy High School in Richmond. It was new then, and the building looked like a Safeway warehouse. The whole design concept was built around the concept of security. And of course, what happened there was just the opposite. It was a terribly sad place. And I won't go into all the details. Years and years later, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, I was a volunteer for the point in time count. And I thought I would be going out to find where people are homeless and start counting them, saying, are you, you have a place to live, or whatever the questions were. And instead, once again in Richmond, I was put behind some kind of a big, thick plastic screen in some kind of a big brick building. I don't even remember what it was, but my way of counting homeless people would be if they would come through this security and come up to the window where I was and make themselves known. Just from the start, that type of thinking has an effect. And it was interesting to see the comparison after all these years. It's the same concept.
Thank you so much. And let's keep this conversation going. So what we know about these systems is that due to historic and structural factors of our nation, that Black, Indigenous people of color have experienced higher rates of these disparities in comparison to white people in the following areas. So when you think about being oppression by discriminatory practices that continue to perpetuate structural and institutional policies, they have negatively impacted people of color. And those systems are the criminal justice system. You mentioned education. When you think about the school to prison pipeline, that is a way that this system or that system continues to keep people of color out or further advance in education. You think about mass incarceration and how people of color are often overrepresented in that segment. We think about employment employment in regards to unemployment and underemployment. Black people are overrepresented in unemployment rates. Black and brown people find it harder to find jobs in industries such as healthcare and nursing, and we're often seen as frontline workers. So when we think about these systems and where we see these disparities, it's evident, it's there, it's for us to see. Somebody mentioned housing, and you mentioned the book of law. Redlining was one of those ways that continued to perpetuate disparities in housing. But let's bring it to the 21st century and think about today. Think about fast forwarding to where we are right now. COVID, Black and brown people have been impacted significantly. Why? Because they live in buildings that are probably overpopulated. They are they're exposed to it. There's no way to escape it because of all of the things that we mentioned. Sometimes there is once you pay your bills, you don't have anything left. So how are we creating and looking at these systems to say, where can we begin to create some of the change that we know that is necessary for us to continue to advance? And Nastasia, you want to tell us how it correlates with our COC?
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to. So when we begin to look at understanding the impact of systemic racism on Black, Indigenous folks of color, You know, one of the impacts is poverty. So we see this overrepresentation of folks who look like me and Monique, who experience extreme poverty, and who experience homelessness across the nation. In the beginning, we gave a snapshot of the data, and it was interesting for folks that remember, you know, Black folks make up this much of the population, 12, 13% of the population, but are 3 and 4 times overrepresented in the homelessness system. Why? Because of these structures that were set up a long time ago to prevent, you know, Black and brown people from, you know, gaining the most appropriate and equitable housing solutions, jobs, banks that deny loans for, you know, to buy homes, creating this generational wealth gap between white and Black Americans. Monique, you mentioned something about the criminal justice system, and you mentioned the school to prison pipeline. The other thing I think about when understanding the impact of this systemic piece is, what about the impact of folks exiting from homelessness back into jails and prison? And so even if we think about it historically, which is why we say like history repeats itself. Historically, folks were going in from, you know, it was from slavery in the 13th, 14th Amendment. So from slavery into jails and prisons. Fast forward, schools to homes, to jails and prisons, homelessness to jails and prisons. And so it's just interesting to see how that plays out continuously over time up into present day. The mass incarceration folks of Black, Indigenous folks of color, more specifically Black and the Hispanic population, the Latinx population, there's huge disparity in numbers. Then we look at understanding housing discrimination piece. And so there's some mentions in the comments that talk about the institutional layer of the housing discrimination piece, and the ways that our systems, you know, align different institutions to help facilitate housing discrimination. And so when we think about it at our COC level, I want to paint a picture, or I want to ask, does some of this resonate? When we look at our exits to permanent housing, do we see this disparity between people of color and folks that identify differently going into institutions rather than something more permanent and stable? Do we see within our data, even today, we look at HMIS data, we look at other comparable data where we see huge disparity in folks going into, remember, deep poverty and then actually experiencing homelessness? I think my question was last time, what's happening in the middle? What's happening in the middle that folks are experiencing, folks who look like myself, folks who look like Monique and Genesis? What's happening between folks going into that deep poverty level, not getting into appropriate housing or permanent housing? And then the housing discrimination piece for folks who work on the ground every day with folks who are experiencing homelessness. What is that experience like, not only for the client, but you as the case manager or the housing navigator trying to get people into the housing that they deserve or that they desire, and not being able to house them how they want to be housed because of, you know, landlords having all this autonomy over who gets in where and how they get in. And so long story short, painting a picture, thinking about these 3 things as a way that the systemic piece impacts these 3 entities. But there's more. This is just a snapshot.
And Stas, just to Nastasia, to pick out the point that Joe brought up, like, let's not forget like this new industry that's on the scene, the weed industry, that all of a sudden people are getting richer off of this, when people have been arrested for insignificant amounts of marijuana and they're serving time now. Like, what does that say? And what is the picture that it paints? And I saw someone else put using media as an important role to perpetuate racial inclinations as well. There are so many things that come in, and what we want you to do is, now that you are aware of where they're coming from, be more intentional about when you see it and how we begin to interrupt it and disrupt it, so we can begin to continue to mitigate these spaces.
I want to make sure that James and Diane White, I think it's Diane, did you have something?
No, I'm sorry. I forgot to take my hand down. I'm sorry.
No worries. I just want to say I see you.
Thank you.
Yes. Nice. Let's go into the institutional level if we can. And so the institutional level of racism refers specifically in which the ways institutions and policies create all these different outcomes for all different racial and ethnic groups. And so institutional racism has been practiced in dominant culture. And when I say dominant culture, I'm talking about white dominant culture for as long as America has been America. And so it's interesting how racism is still socially perpetuated and how it still exists in our social context. The decisions that control our lives and resources are rarely in the hands of people who look like me because of racism. And so as a consequence, we may assume that white people are more knowledgeable about what needs to be done for folks who look like me. White folks are more knowledgeable about folks' needs per, just general society. It's also really possible that Black folks fail to support each other in this space of power. So we think about we're at work and we're in these meetings with other white people. We also think about Black folks being the only one, or there's two in the room at a time amongst their white colleagues and peers. And it's this thing about supporting each other in these spaces and within this institutional structure of authority and power. What's interesting here is that we fail to support each other's own sphere of influence and authority and power, especially when it's challenged by white privilege. And so currently we're in a system that exists for folks of color that rewards folks that side with white supremacy. Or in layman's terms, we're in a culture that exists that rewards Black folks agreeing with the white man, right? And so what this does is it punishes those who don't necessarily agree in those spaces. And so fast forward, these practices that are upheld by white dominant culture are trajected in society, are trajected in our traditions that are now socially accepted. And we talk about like swimming in these white dominant culture norms and, forgetting that we're swimming in the water because these norms become invisible to us because they're so normal. We live, we breathe, we eat these norms, right? And so as we continue to practice what's socially accepted, our spheres of influence and our social behavior, it bleeds out in education, within government, within politics, all the way down to religion. And so what I would like folks to really grasp here when we start to dive deeper into the institutional level are that these traditions and beliefs and opinions, the myths that are associated, they have not been challenged enough to be dismantled because these are traditional ways of how I myself, Monique, you do it too, how we operate in society and how we accept what we believe are facts and what we believe to be understood or what we believe to be normal behavior and practices, but it's really not. We just haven't found a way, or we haven't challenged our societal conditions enough to dismantle those. So I want us to kind of think about that in a sense. I also want to say that these practices, so these norms, they have a reverse impact on folks of color. And it drills down to the historical context that we talked about in the first session. And I want to also put some emphasis on that these norms have great impact on historically marginalized populations. I'll just pause there. Thoughts, opinions. Okay. Let's get into some illustrations of institutional racism to really paint a picture. So we talked about institutionalized housing discrimination. So overall, in general, what does institutional racism look like in general context as it relates to housing and homelessness? We talked about these things already. It's the restrictive covenants. It was the redlining. It is the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. It was the GI Bill that perpetuated racism through policy, right? Among a whole bunch of other national and local policies that perpetuated institutional racism. These same policies have, I'm not gonna say potentially, it did eliminate any potential and opportunity for generational wealth accumulation in Black and Brown communities. And so I want us to think about other examples of illustrations of institutional racism as it relates to general context. And then we'll get into some more specific context as it relates to COC and organizational level means. So what are some of the things that you can think of as it relates to just really general? This will just get us warmed up to think more COC specific examples of institutional racism. You all can popcorn out, you can call out or unmute yourselves, but what do you think those things look like? Folks, we're used to silence. Silence is good. Silence means folks are thinking. I know it may be uncomfortable for some folks, but it's not uncomfortable for us. Marriage laws, absolutely. Black Wall Street, let's talk about it. Required criminal background checks for people entering subsidized housing programs. Absolutely. What are other things? What about requirements to access for treatment? I know folks were talking about healthcare and means into healthcare. Something that Daryl had emphasized last time was the means of how different insurance policies and insurances work. That's huge. What about limiting the availability or accessibility for voices with lived experience in spaces? Yep. What else? When we think about like overall organizational culture, maybe where we worked or where we worked in the past, institutions that are set up to not be as transparent in their mission and vision, organizations that are set up to not have conversations about race that are encouraged in spaces. We think about hiring and recruitment practices. For some reason, folks never find a qualified Black person for whatever reason that is. But we think about those types of hiring practices, credentials, capacity for training and growth opportunities. What are others? Different penalties for different versions of the same drug, crack cocaine, absolutely. Project-based housing areas considered lower class, absolutely. Educational opportunities, yes.
I want to jump in real quick about the educational side of things. We were talking about history and how, like with the education, there's a whole part of American history that is not in our education that we don't get when we're in elementary school, junior high, high school. I didn't learn it until I was in college, which was like in my early 30s. So there's this whole kind of there's that discussion of how do we make change when we don't even know that change needs to happen. So you have to get educated first, but to get that education, we first have to change the system. So there's this like back and forth thing that I think is talked like, yes, that.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
No, for sure, for sure. No, I totally agree. It all trickles back down to this educational piece that we don't get. And what's interesting is our nation and states within our nation continuously put these parameters on, critical race theory and teaching our history in the classroom and determining what is appropriate history versus what's not so appropriate, which is interesting, and a whole nother conversation. But absolutely, absolutely.
This is Susan. I am curious though, if it's not knowing that, I don't see how, I just don't see how you can't know. And unless there's a narrative that's present that says, you must live this way, you must live this way, you must exhibit this poverty because you're a person of color. Now, you might not look underneath it, but you certainly tell across the culture that that's prevalent. So there has to be some narrative and thought process that's feeding that observation, whether whether we've been educated to it or not. And I know we haven't been. It is not, I mean, some of you have not been, lots of us have been, that it is just not in the system. It is a matter of the inquiry. And even now, if we don't take it on ourselves to inquire, it's going to stay the same. And I dismiss that as a reality, but it feels so. Like logically, if we continue to say, but I don't know, and you don't give it to me in this public education process that I have, yet it's still very obvious. If we don't take the initiative, if we don't self-generate the initiative, I don't see how then it would change either. I'll say it that way.
Come on, Susan from Oakland, California. I know that's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm loving the reactions down here. Folks, feel free to give reactions, give folks energy. Absolutely. Heather,
Oh, this
you
is
have something.
Heather. So I do. So I'm going to say something uncomfortable for me.
Oh, I like it. Speak your truth.
Well, I don't know. So I grew up in a population 4,000 town in the middle of California, and there was not mixed race, right? So it was homogenous, Hispanic. It wasn't, and so I have to say, there is ignorance. Some of it's active, but some of it's benign, right? Because if you don't know, if you grew up somewhere, we can't, I think that global assumption that everybody is actively ignorant. There are pockets of people. And so if it's not part of the education, not everybody knows. We're making assumptions about what parents who are struggling with feeding their children are doing and how enlightened they are. There are people that are also trying to feed their families and just worrying about other things and are blind. And so I think I think we do a disservice if we assume everybody is actively and maliciously doing it. There is benign, so it has to be so I guess the end of this is it has to be part of education, because this is not everybody's lived experience. Not everybody's in urban and suburban areas. So that's my very uncomfortable.
I appreciate you for being uncomfortable. I appreciate you for speaking your truth. And I think you're absolutely right. What we need to realize is that it's not everyone's lived experience. And so I think it trickles back down to, we were all brought up really differently with these different teachings and ideas within the household, within our schooling and education, that we just don't know what we don't know. But this is the time for course correction, as I would say. And so now we can start to course correct and start to understand, and begin to understand what this looks like, especially for folks experiencing racism and inequality daily. But I think you have a wonderful point. Let's get into how this relates to COC. I want to talk about, or I would like to talk about COC and organizational level. Examples that are tied to funding allocations, hiring practice, triage and prioritization, service provision and delivery. So we're still talking institutional level, but now we're diving deeper into how these entities, and there's more, but this is just to give folks a blueprint of where to go when talking about the institutional level as it relates to these things. I'm going to put this link into the chat. So remember, we want to make sure that you all have some walkaway products. So I am going to share my screen. If you all will meet me on Mural, that would be greatly appreciated. So one of the things, and I saw in the chat, I wish somebody would write this down because there's no way that I can remember this. Absolutely, this is the reason for the mural. Let's see, share desktop to share. For those of you who may have some technical difficulties using Mural, that is okay. Just write whatever into the chat and Monique and Genesis will populate Mural for us. So those of you who are having a difficult time, just either popcorn out or chat in. One way to utilize Mural, if you're on a keyboard and on your trackpad, if you move your fingers in and out, it makes the board or the page bigger. So you can go in and out, that will zoom. Also, if you scroll down, you'll see the actual board. You'll see the board that we're working on. Okay, oops, going a little too fast. Okay, so we're gonna focus on this first one. So name factors that might perpetuate racism. We're gonna talk about funding first. So what you wanna do is just click on one of the little circles here in this area. And again, if folks are having trouble, don't even worry about it, we got you. Let's talk about some factors that might perpetuate inequalities when it comes down to funding allocations and or decisions. I realize that folks are coming from a COC space and folks are coming from provider network spaces. So whatever makes sense in those spaces, feel free to contribute.
Nastasia, I'm not trying to navigate Mural. That was a little overwhelming for me.
No
But this is Erica McWhorter, and I love this. I have so many thoughts and ideas, so I just want to popcorn a few out here. In terms of funding allocations, use and decisions, I've had conversations with a number of smaller agencies and providers recently, and over the past couple of years since being with the county. And one of the things that has come to my attention is just the lack of capacity building for the nonprofit partners, especially partners that are BIPOC-led or that primarily support BIPOC communities. And what that really starts to look like is that there aren't processes and there aren't decisions made with them in the room or with them in mind. Specifically around funding allocations, there are opportunities, some of which I hope for our community to explore at some point, of really thinking about carving out set-asides for BIPOC-led agencies and agencies that are focused on supporting communities of color. It's not unheard of to set aside dollars for specific populations. Why not dollars for priority agencies that we're going to need on the ground, that's going to represent people of color and who are going to be able to further build on the existing capacity of the continuum of care to support people of color generally. And, this is also an issue of access, right? An issue of people of color being able to access not only the systems of power, but participating in them as agents of change, as these agents that are supposed to be leaders in the community, and as other entities who might be white-led but have all of the funding and all of the resources to provide all of the services. You can't get other people in when there's a monopoly, and that's perpetuated by the way the funding comes down or the way the system is set up. So that's one of my little rants.
Well, Erica, so one, nice to hear from you. And two, you said a lot. I totally agree. Do folks within either Erica's sphere or closely related to Erica, what are you all's thoughts? How would you all respond to that?
This is Alex. I would say that, I mean, Erica, everything she just said is so true and is really just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, even, you know, in my organization where most of the leaders are white, you know, we don't have resources and funding to offer quality professional leadership development training for young and up and coming leaders of color. That's not something that the system provides for. And so not only are we at a disadvantage there, but also because we're so under-resourced as well, we are not able to come together and collaborate with other providers to really fight these systemic racism. Like, these issues that we're trying to tackle are so big, and here we are fighting over crumbs. So how are we supposed to step back and really change the way we work with each other, both internally in terms of developing our leaders of color and externally making some systemic change?
Nice. I totally agree. I think the sheet is moving around because you all are super active. This is great. Monique, can you read me off some of these, please?
Absolutely, I got you covered. So some of the things that we are seeing is definitely the capacity building, fewer standing relationships with donors and investors, funding for agencies that support people of color, which was something I know that I think Erica also referenced. We have set aside dollars for BIPOC specific populations, capacity building opportunities, and decision-making, non-representative boards to review and approve funding like that. We also have a lack of transparency with data to understand which populations have the greatest need and disparities. And then there is also, the effects of Black codes during the Reconstruction. This is an old comment, but the pipe, I think this goes somewhere else, but that's okay. And then the last one is, smaller grassroots organizations that have to turn in more grant report updates than larger organizations because they have to prove themselves.
Okay, nice.
And we have a hand too. Joe has her hand up as well.
Let's talk about it, Joe.
Yeah, because I've been trying to formulate this opinion and it's hard. I wrote it in the chat 2 or 3 different times and it's just not coming out okay. So there's this piece that on this like nonprofit, you know, there's a piece that's having to actually apply for those grants or for those, the money that might be available. The application process itself, like there is certain language that would, I don't know how to say that. I'm trying to formulate that in the moment, but the application process, gathering the stuff that's needed, having to write the bylaws, all the legalities behind everything, all of those little things. They're not provided for the nonprofits that are looking for money to provide services. And there's something there that I'm trying to figure out.
No, I like where you're going with this, Joe. If we could piggyback off where you're going with this and talk about how we might disrupt inequalities or racism that we see as it pertains to our funding allocations. When I say our, I feel like we're in this together, but I know that I'm not in your region, but you all's funding allocations, use and decision around fundings. So let's name some of those factors that may disrupt some of those inequalities.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think language was mentioned, and I think it's very important because there's an institutional language that has developed, which is designed to protect institutionality. And I think that it would serve everybody better if that could be disrupted so that plain language, the kind that might be used in a conversation, can be allowed when you're applying for a grant, rather than translating everything into some social services dialect.
Oh, yes, this is why language is important and context of the language is important, which is why we start off with the language piece. Absolutely. Erica,
Hi,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think one of the other things that um, is important is that when we try to put in for grants, a lot of times they ask you for balance sheets and audited financial statements. But if you are working with a little amount of money, we learn how to, as African Americans, we learn how to feed a family on a dime, and so we sometimes have to run our nonprofits like that as well. And so we don't have audited financial statements and we don't have assets to speak of, and so it's really hard to get larger sums of money if you don't already have that in place. But how do you get that in place when that is a requirement to get it in place?
So what you're saying is some education and training around that to help prepare these smaller grassroots agencies to be able to compete for funding.
Right. Some way, and I have a degree in accounting, so I could kind of piecemeal it together, but it still is not impressive because there's not a whole lot.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. I like a lot of these statements and comments and potential solutions within this board. Talks and speaks about breaking out the data by race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity paints a picture of your story, the data behind how your COC looks or how your organization looks is really important when it comes to the funding folks go out for and the funding you receive. I also think that there's something about ways to invest or ways to solicit more flexible funding options to serve historically marginalized populations within organization and COC. What that looks like is really different in communities, but the means to adopt more flexible funding streams has been really beneficial in communities. I also am drawn to this statement as well, COC commitment to increasing capacity of Black, Indigenous folks of color led projects and agencies. It reminds me of like, who are our cross-sector partners that align with also promoting equity in spaces that maybe folks can partner with when it comes to getting funding that serves that population. Also the commitment to resources to do things like what we're doing now, but the commitment to resources that are specifically embedded, ingrained in promoting equity. One example is exactly what we're doing here. You all COC our community's commitment to even have these conversations and drive what this could look like. If other communities invested monies, which planning grant monies, whatever money pays for this type of training and consultation, I think is really beneficial when thinking about ways to utilize funding to advance equity in spaces. I like this. Nice. Team, Monique, anything that I'm missing here?
No, I think we're ready to talk about hiring practices.
Let's talk about hiring practices. So name factors that might perpetuate inequalities as it relates to hiring practices. Again, wherever your sphere of influence lies or your lived experience lies, whether it's at CLC level, organization level, or in general, what are some factors that might perpetuate institutional ways of hiring practices? Recruitment efforts. Yep, go ahead, listening.
Just not even thinking about hiring practices. I think when my sons were born, I looked at them and said, I have to give you a name where your application would not be immediately thrown aside. I mean, to have to think that like that when you're looking at a newborn that is only a couple of hours old, I had to think about the fact that their name was going to be on everything that they would send out. And so let's make that name something that no one could tell from your name what you were.
Come on, absolutely. That we're also going to speak about bias, and that goes will go along great with our bias conversation. But you're absolutely right. The names in the hiring and career world, they matter.
And I want to bring up the someone mentioned or referenced judging hairstyles. And the Crown Act is definitely something that I know was passed, I think, in only 8 states. So when you think about what you could do, even from that perspective, really embracing natural hair and ethnic styles. So something that's definitely something else. And Charlene, I like that, hair slayers.
Absolutely. For folks in the room that are not aware or adept with hair in the Black and Brown community, it's a big deal. It's a big deal nowadays that we are embracing our natural hair, as you can see the puff, and navigating our natural hair spaces. But it's something that goes along with that interpersonal personal bias when it comes to hair in the workplace or hair in schools, making kids cut off their dreads to play basketball. The hair thing is a big deal. If you don't know, ask somebody. I wish we had time to talk about it here. But yes, so let me read some of these. So hiring practices, the tokenism versus actual decision-making power. How many times Black and Brown folks have we been tokenized in these spaces, not only in this hiring realm, but in the realm of to educate others, what should happen and what should take place. Lack of diversity in honoring the team standardized tests for job eligibility. Those recruitment efforts. There's a lot of Black folks that are highly qualified. And when I say Black folks, I'm talking about Black, Indigenous, folks of color. What else? Requiring criminal background checks. Yeah, that's a huge one. A lot. How might we be able to remove some of the red tape and really truly invite folks with lived experience? Lived experience means a lot of things. And folks who come with criminal backgrounds, especially in this space, bring a lot of depth and knowledge to the folks that you actually serve with criminal backgrounds, with terrible credit, and all of the above, right? Let's see. Over-reliance on degrees versus lived experience. Absolutely. What about over-reliance on degrees versus years of experience folks have actually doing the work? What does the piece of paper really mean? Question mark, question mark. I like all of these. Let's talk about ways that we may disrupt this institutional piece as it relates to hiring practices. So what would that look like?
I'm going to jump in on that discussion of the names, because that's been big. But I feel like people of color should have the right to start to say, I don't want to use my government name anymore. Like, there's this quote unquote government name. A lot of, like, when they find this identity, this, like, the conversations that I've had with people who have found their family identity, they've changed their name to their family name, and they only use their quote unquote government name when they're applying for applications or when they're applying for funds. But then they have to dance back and forth between their family culture name and then their government name that was given to them. And I just feel like when they're doing this application process, that the name, that's what we need to stop. We need to stop judging just the name itself, and knowing the person or the culture that's applying for it.
Right.
And I think it's a combination of not having people feel that they have to choose or deny who they are at their core to fit in and assimilate. And that means that they have to be able to be accepted for who they are. So in a sense where we are saying, oh, I want you to use this name, I should be able to show up and use whichever name it is that I feel comfortable with. And it's the part of you receiving who I am authentically, right? Not me having to change or switch, but when I show up as Monique or the name that it would have been Unique Kiosha, but they decided not to name me that, I should be able to show up in that space who I am in either or of those names and be accepted. And that's something that I think when we talk about creating those cultural humility workplaces and workspaces, we have to dig deep into what is your culture like? Is your culture inclusive where people feel that they can show up as a mother, as a caregiver, as a frontline worker, or will they be judged if one hat or they're dominating in one space one day than the other? So I think that I just wanted to raise that we have to be mindful and change our thought process of saying, I want you to change, instead of saying, no, this atmosphere and this environment needs to change.
Yes.
So some of the things that I appreciate that, Monique, thank you. Some of the things that I'm seeing here is reduce educational requirements when possible. Absolutely. Diversity job postings sources, yes. Diversify hiring panel. Absolutely. Offer benefits that are, oh geez. Enticing to Black, Indigenous folks of color. What do others say?
I love the lived experience, not only at the entry level, and there's great ways when you think about doing that, like bringing them in as partners, right? Like we have partners who have lived experience, because just because they don't have a degree, that experience can outweigh that degree. And so when you think about having someone with lived experience from the front door to the boardroom, that's shifting power, that's shifting paradigm, because now what you're saying is, I see you, I value what you have to say, I value your experience. And that's how we really begin to dismantle some of these practices, by saying, you know what, we're going to shake up the bag in a sense, and say, as we shake up the bag, I like to say flip over the table, so we can create a whole new setting for people to come in and feel included.
Let's move on to triage and prioritization. So this came up last time in the conversation. I'm really excited to get to this piece. What do I mean by triage and prioritization tools? This will go a couple different ways. We can start off with the VI SPDAT. Everybody likes to talk about the VI SPDAT and how equitable and not equitable the VI SPDAT is. So what are some inequalities that may perpetuate those inequalities on VI SPDAT for folks of color? What does that look like? Or if you don't use the VI SPDAT, a similar or comparable tool. And then you all have to educate us. What do you all use in California? Is it the VI SPDAT? Jamie, I think I'm Jamie, Erica.
Yep, we use the Contra Cost that we use the VI.
Okay, nice. I think iPhone has something to say, and I'm sorry, I want to say your name.
Donna.
Donna. Okay, perfect.
Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm listening.
I just think that perhaps we could eliminate the whole entire question at all. What race or ethnicity are you? What does it matter what race or ethnicity they are? They need the same help as the next person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes beautiful sense. Yeah, why the need for folks to identify racially and ethnically? What else? What about triage tools or the triage process may make it or may create disparities for folks? We talk about language and how questions are being asked. We talk about this scoring process? What do scores mean as it pertains to where people are housed? I think that's interesting. What else?
So much of it is done verbally, and if somebody who's doing the assessment, just doesn't connect because they have different life experiences, then there's going to be a disconnect in the score.
Dana, hey, I think it was you who mentioned about the
Yes,
VI last time.
Good memory.
I was
Yes,
looking for you.
I've been waiting for this conversation.
I have been looking for you this whole time. So yes, when thinking about ways to really tie this back to the COC, I think you made a beautiful point last time, as we need to put more emphasis and think about how our tools are really inequitable, and having some thoughtful conversation about how we might disrupt how those tools are utilized within the COC. And let's just talk about it. Let's talk about ways to disrupt that. I know there's a lot of conversation that's happening across the country hey, let's just make our own triage and prioritization tool. That's one way to do it, but you have to have funding to do that. I'm not in your pockets. I don't know what you gotta look like as a COC, just a suggestion. But funding to put towards a more equitable tool. What about rephrasing the questions? What about not considering what a score says to determine where people go? So let's talk about ways to disrupt these inequalities.
Systems.
Yeah, systems. Go ahead, I'm listening. John, and you had your hand up for some time. John Russell.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was just going to say kind of the counterpoint to why do we need to collect race and ethnicity. In a lot of ways, I think we need to collect more of that and think more intersectionally about priority, because so many of our tools are like what I would call like a medicalized model. They look at the person as an isolated individual and stack conditions like medical conditions or otherwise, versus realizing that there are the social structural factors that are left completely out in terms of vulnerabilities. And if we know that there is, massive discrimination and wealth theft and all the rest for different populations and barriers, and why shouldn't we prioritize those things more directly? And so those were kind of left out, I think, in a lot of our very individualistic looking assessments, or not neutral.
And I want to say you're absolutely right. And this is why that race data is crucial, because that data, as I think Jamie mentioned it, right? It tells us where those inequalities exist. And so we can make sure that we're not continuing to perpetuate them using the same tool. And so you need the race data to identify the problem, right? To really think about, do that root cause analysis to determine where it is coming from. You won't be able to necessarily do that if you group everybody together, because if you're not serving them the same, it won't look the same. So that's why that race data is needed. And thank you, John, for bringing that up. Donna has her hand up, and then after Donna, we'll swing back to you, Joe.
Again, I agree that we have to find out where the problem comes from. But at the point we're at with the VI SPDOT, we've already accepted these people into our program, and we're trying to identify their vulnerability of housing. And it doesn't matter. I don't believe that the color of their skin matters to identify how vulnerable they are to homelessness. If we're all put in the same pot with the same color, I agree their health disparities may be something that considered towards it, and that's a necessity of a question. But whether I'm white or the gentleman sitting next to me is black, and we both have chronic heart failure, let's say, or something of that sort, it doesn't matter what color we are at that point. We still need the same service. We need someplace to live. Yes. And and that's why the vulnerability scoring is so important, with more maybe precise questions. Race is, I'm sure, part of the issue, but the more precise questions you can get, and some of them are asked 2 or 3 different ways, on the same form, to get a number of who needs help immediately and who doesn't. And I agree there has to be some kind of system there to figure out who's more needed than the other. But I don't think our race should be one of those things that are considered for that.
And Donna, what we've seen historically and what we've seen through the data is that when you know who you're serving, it is different, because white people are served more and better in the system than people of color. And so it's an indication. That's what the data says nationally. That's what it leads us to. And so we, in order to really address the inequity, you have to address the issue of race. And so this is why we continue to put ourselves in predicaments in spaces like this, so that we can educate ourselves to learn how we, as those people who are in the system, continuing to do this work, or continuing to get in the good trouble, as the late Senator John Lewis said, to make sure that we are doing it the right way and kind of going back and course correcting. Joe, I'm gonna call on you.
Hello, I'm in a meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna chime in about peer support, because the peer support, we were talking about lived experience, and we're talking about, like, there is a specific way in the peer model that you can capture the lived experience of somebody who's in crisis. And getting this peer model to get that, it's trauma-informed media. There is this ongoing kind of concept of gathering that information on a one-on-one basis, or maybe a 1-on-5 basis, and when you get that very personalized story from the lived experience, that's when you start to collect that data on what each individual needs. And then that gives you more ability to figure out the resources that they need based on their lived experience, their personal lived experience. So peer support is always my niche.
Nice. Let's move to, yeah, go ahead, I'm listening.
No, I was just saying non-clinical. That's essential. It was in the chat, non-clinical peer support.
One of my colleagues, can we capture that and put it in the table? Let's talk about service provision and delivery. So some things that may perpetuate inequalities in our service delivery, and for folks who look like me and Monique, what are some of those things within our institutional structure?
Peer support groups are not really alive, but they help. They're very helpful and it's needed. I'm sorry to just horn in like that, but I ran a peer support group for years and I trained some doctors and it works. I've been perpetuated by grief and trauma because I lost my son, my mother, and 2 other family members last year. So I'm back now. So I feel strong enough to do what I do. So a lot of that I let go. It's a woman in San Francisco that's leading the Healing Circles group now. Hi. So they join her when possible. But I found out I can't do that anymore. It brings up too much and I won't continue. But last Sunday, I was at a homeless camp by Brookside Hospital and the people received me. I know some of them. And it's like, to me, I was with, I was in the Everyone Home, the homeless group over in Oakland. And I started to join them because my power is, not my power, but my intuition led me there. And I had a meeting with the RRS. And in doing so, I'm waiting on the next meeting because they want to give out all the stimulus checks to the homeless before the end of this year. So I was over there signing people up, and then, the power of some of the homeless, I have to respect them. And I know I was over there, I had on a mask and I passed out some masks, but those people need to be in homes. And I don't believe in that RVs and all that is gonna help. They need to be in homes, and in everyone's home study in Oakland, they found out that by being homeless, it was it was racial, it's a racial thing, and she had a report on it that there's too many Blacks out here not being served. And so my thing is, if we're gonna do this, let's do it right and get these people a house. I do have experience where I help get a lot of people homes by giving them Section 8 vouchers. Well, I had help, but I had a whole list of HUD's Section 8. When they first come out, I used to do that. I've got women. I had a friend that was in prison. She used to come and stay with me every time she got out. But what happened to her, she would go back because she couldn't meet the requirements of the parole boards. She would get out at the Sacramento bus station. By the time I got down there to pick her up, she was buying drugs. So she was going back continuously. So, so that's a big problem with some of them. They can't resist the drugs. So we can't look at them like they don't know anything or anything, but I'm going to cut off now. I got a lot of lived experiences myself, from way back that I can offer. Okay, thank you. I don't want to thank you.
I want to say thank you, Ms. Charlene, for honoring and speaking your truth first and foremost. I think that there's such great value when we bring our voices into the room. And what I want to highlight is you said a few key things that we all can walk away with, right? Your sphere of influence is important. That the people that you went amongst and you were amongst that were experiencing homelessness, they trusted Ms. Charlene to give them good information and to be a resource to them, which is why they were willing to come to you. The other thing that I want to make sure we don't slide over is the fact that you have to understand what are triggers for people who've experienced trauma. And so, and acknowledging your own triggers and saying, I can't do that because it takes me to a place, and then working with people to say somebody else has to step in. When we are doing this work around homelessness, when you're encountering someone who's experiencing homelessness or has experienced it, we need to not act as though there was no trauma that exists. And if you are a person who's working with that person that may have experienced trauma, that may be a trigger for you. And so we'll talk a little bit about trauma. We won't go deep today, but I don't want us to skip over that, because when you have so many traumatic experiences, even when they do the ACE study, and if you're familiar with ACEs, or if I have any social workers in the room, it's been proven that young people who have more traumatic experiences as a child, it surfaces through mental health and other ways as they get older. So we can't ignore the fact that trauma does play a role in this, and we need to make sure that we have trauma-informed care, trauma-informed services. So when we see these things and we see them arise, that we are equipped to deal with them on the front line. We are equipped to deal with them in the boardroom. We are equipped to deal with them at every layer of our system. And I want to say, Angel, I think you have your hand up, so I want to allow you to speak, and then I think Nastasia is going to bring us back in.
Awesome, thank you. So I just wanted to add on to this, because in school, I did a research project last semester on decolonizing trauma studies. And I think this is really important to like the service delivery aspect of this, because I think what a really hidden issue within like social work and providing those services is the fact that a lot of traditional trauma frameworks and ways of giving therapy are developed by people who are white. And so they don't know they're not equipped to handle things like generational trauma that arises from being systemically marginalized throughout your entire like family history. It doesn't deal with things of like growing up as a child and having to deal with racism or things like that. And so I think like the whole trauma-informed approach is really important, again, because the current dominant frameworks of therapy and trauma are just not adequate for a lot of people's lived experiences and really addressing that. So I just wanted to speak on that for a bit.
Yes, I appreciate that, Angel. And I've been watching and reading your comments, and I think it all applies. Let's wrap this piece up with what we can do to disrupt inequalities in our service provision and our delivery. So let's just popcorn out. We'll add it to the board. What are some of the things that we can do now with our sphere of influence?
This is Jonathan again. I'll just jump in from the service provider's perspective, and all love to our funders and system administrators here. But I think one of the real barriers to the field is the administrativization of the field. Like there has been an increasing move towards like the necessity of like documentation and HMIS complexities and service entry and all of the very often inequitably distributed skills, business, work skills and understanding of how to utilizing the tech and the amount of administrative like capacity and all these things. Like you have to have had a certain life experience and a certain work experience to be able to handle that workload. And so I think one of the things we can do to disrupt those providers is push back on some of those systems, so that the folks that have a different set of skills that are equally, if not more essential to really doing this work and really connecting with people and overcoming barriers, are not pushed out of this critical work for those that have to have gone to college and can, do a lot of administrative work and do services and HMIs, all of this. So I think we have to find the good of creating like more tech-based systems without having it really push out the folks who should be leading that sort of work. For just people that have certain administrative capacity, the optimism for privilege.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to make sure I capture, oh, John, folks are saying you're echoing some. Okay, I see you got your headphones. Nice, nice. So if there's other things, you all can go ahead and popcorn those in. I want to make sure we leave some space to talk about our interpersonal selves and our interpersonal spheres of influence. You all have mentioned a lot about bias. I'm going to stop share. Genesis, if you could bring us back. We talked a lot about biases and ways to think about and look at bias. So I want to make sure we have some time, or we spend some time on those pieces. This mural is going to be available for you all pretty much forever. And I'm hoping, and we're hoping, that you all can utilize the mural to further dissect some of the inequalities that may perpetuate racist or disparities within those themes that we mentioned, and then how are ways that you can begin to disrupt those through policy and so forth. But we'll talk about that in detail in later sessions. Miss Monique.
Yes, I mean, great. Thank you all for having such great dialogue around what we could do around policy, hiring practices, and looking at funding allocation and the triage tools that are used within the systems, and then in the service provision and delivery piece as well. And so that feeds really well in understanding the next level of racism, which is the interpersonal piece. And so the definition is on the screen, but I want you to really think about the interpersonal piece as being that interaction or expression that you have with individuals, right? Personally, like when we start to see people's personal beliefs come up and prejudice come up, right? Those biases of what you think about going into a situation around someone. Let's use the same example of the name, right? If you read a name before you hire that person, are you likely to pick that application and put it to the side? Or are you inquisitive to say, let me see what this person has to bring to the table? Even as when we look at like what we see on social media, right? What are some examples that you see around interpersonal racism on social media? And feel free to unmute or drop it in the chat. What are some of the examples we see about on social media around interpersonal racism?
Are you referring to that we're finally having access to see things happening out in the community that we didn't have before? So it was happening before. Now we just are getting access to these through social media and videos and stuff. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, and thank you for naming that as well. So somebody else brought up so many examples. White people trying to gatekeep police, BIPOC in the community. So even the fact that you're like, now we see it. It wasn't that it wasn't always there, right? now there's more light shed on it. Even, and I'm gonna push us a little bit further. What are the levels or the interpersonal racism that you are seeing within your system and your institution with each other? Anybody want to share some of those examples? And I take silence as a form of agreement.
I'm going to jump in real quick because there's this when the police come into the unhoused population in their community, either be tent cities or whatever you want to call it, like they come in and do their sweeps, and they focus on people of color. They will sweep their property and destroy their property before they would touch me when I was out there. Like they literally just walked right past me and went to the other people that were not of a white woman and destroyed their entire living quarters. And that happened all the time. So
thank you, Shanna. And so when we think about dissecting systemic racism and institutional, it's important to acknowledge that interpersonal racism can cause, or it can cause the ripple in those other institutions, because that's the interaction with people. And we have to make sure that when we look at them, like, how are we creating, again, that culture humility space for people to show up where they don't feel like they have to be one certain way, but when you're interacting with them, you're interacting with them as their full whole self and not a piece of them, right? If we think about how does racial bias affect the way we think about race, right? Implicit bias is an unconscious association. It's an attitude towards something. It's an attitude, in this instance, toward people or a specific social group due to what you've experienced. People often attribute that to certain qualities or maybe even certain characteristics, but when you to a specific group. But when we think about how we interact with people interpersonally, what are some things that happens, right? There's some unintended consequences when we come into things with bias. Think about what happens on an employee level or case manager level interaction. Think about what happens case manager to client interaction. What are those biases that you're bringing in? And explicit are the things that you are aware of, right? Implicit are the things that you're unaware of. And they both impact the person that you're serving. They both impact the people that we work with. Think about how we can continue to look at and again, address those explicit and implicit bias to make the services better, to make the organization better. And so as we continue to think about that, racism happens without conscious racist thought. That's why it's so scary. There are a lot of things that people have been taught, that it's embedded in you, that you have to go back and unlearn. And the question is, are you willing to put in the work? Are you willing to make the effort so that when you become better as a person, the system becomes better? Because people make the system. So as you continue to dig through, what are my biases? What do I need to check? What are the things that I'm aware of? And what are the things that I'm unaware of? And when I'm unaware of them, what are the unintentional consequences that happen to people who are exposed to me in that moment? And when you look at both the explicit and implicit, and you think about what you need to do, the change is that process that you take yourself through so that you yourself become better and not, we often hear that phrase, implicit bias can also be a way where people are racist, or they call it nice nasty, right? But being nice nasty, your intent has an impact on someone. And so that course correction that Nastasia has referenced, and we referenced a few times today, it's extremely necessary. We have to disrupt white cultural norms because they are destroying people. It's causing different levels of stress. And then when we think about it from even the aspect of race and ethnicity, like we want to know, and this is a question that we're going to lead into, but when did you realize that race and ethnicity was a factor for you?
When we think, Yeah, go ahead, Monique. No, go ahead. No, you're on the road. No, go ahead.
And as we were preparing, it was even a conversation that we as women of color had to make sure, when did race come up for you? Was it when you were younger? Was it in middle school? Was it in high school? And if anybody wants to be open to share, we're also watching the time, but when did you realize that your race and your ethnicity had an impact on how you were viewed in society? And I'm gonna open it up for somebody to share. Anastasia, I'm gonna tee it over to you.
All right. As folks begin to think about their experience and popcorn out or put into the chat, I'll make sure I get these into Mural. But I want to paint a picture that implicit bias is the reason why Black men are read as threatening in situations where white people are not read as threatening. When we think about the police, because you all have brought up the police numerous times, it makes an officer see a gun when there's really a cell phone. It makes, teachers read Black and brown children as being or having behavioral problems versus white students' behavior being somewhat just intense or more precious, right? When we bring it down to an organizational level, that implicit bias makes supervisors and executive leadership look at, Black women who push back on opposing ideas or opinions and who are really passionate about their work. It makes it seem like they're conflict causing. They're considered what you all have probably heard in mainstream, the angry Black woman. And so painting a picture of what that looks like in general, overall, and in the organization, I think is really important as we think about how folks look at or think about bias as it pertains to race. But back to Monique's question, when did you realize that your race and ethnicity had an impact on how you were viewed or how you fared in society? I shared an example with Monique earlier that I was young, maybe 9, 12 years old. Do you all remember those animal backpacks? So it's maybe a generational thing, but I remember I got an animal backpack for Christmas. I utilized that backpack as my purse. So, I had my little wallet, I had my little lotion and wipes in there, and I was carrying it around and all of that. But we went to the hair store and my mother said, you better leave that bag in the car. And I'm like, why? It has my wallet in it. Because you don't bring book bags into stores, period, especially a hair store. Black folks are not treated the greatest in hair stores, even though we patronize them like nobody's business, right? But that's one experience for me. Diane.
Yeah, okay. I was told by my parents on how we were supposed to behave in public. So we were told the same stories that I taught my sons. If the police stop you, be nice, don't get upset. Certain things that certain ways you had to behave, even if you were upset, hold it in, express it later, so that you're not looked like the angry Black woman, or someone doesn't call the authorities on you. So as a child, we are taught that there's certain ways that we have to behave.
And I think, Diane, you're absolutely right. And I see what we're receiving in the chat. Like it started, or the realization is as early as 5 years old, second grade for some. And this is something that it continues, right? Because we know that it doesn't stop. I've heard stories and had experiences where we were in a training and someone shared that they were walking down the street as a woman of color and saw a male and immediately grabbed their pocketbook to shift their straps. And when she realized what she was doing, she was perpetuating that Black man was a threat to her, even though he showed nothing alarming. He looked and smiled, right? So when you think about what we are taught and what we experience, the impact that it has on the other person, he may have felt like I'm just walking down the street. But because this picture of being a Black tyrant is painted, that person felt threatened. And now it's almost as if he has to adjust and think about, well, when I'm walking down the street, how do I make myself look non-threatening? So think about the things that people have to carry and walk into as they go out. And I see someone else had a hand up as well. And I don't see the hands anymore.
Okay, can I share one more incident?
Sure.
at working. I worked for the federal government, and it was a training. So there was about 50 of us in class. And of the 50, there were maybe 6 Blacks. And so we were all just sitting there talking. And when it was time to sit down, they said, okay, now make sure we sit in different places. And I said, why do we have to sit in different places? They said, well, you can't all sit together. It's looked at badly if we all sit together. And I looked around, I said, well, there's a whole row of white people over there, a whole row of white people over here. Why can't we sit together? And it was just in their minds, it was like, you can't all sit together because it's going to be a problem.
Listen, I'm happy you brought that up. That is a historical thing that is ingrained in us and that continues to be ingrained in us, even in this workspace and people in offices of, all the Black folks, getting together because it looks like something. Where does that stem from? Did that stem from, when slavery was happening, Black folks were not allowed to congregate together, come together, because maybe they were making plans to escape or for revenge or something similar. I'm happy you bring that up because a lot of that comes up in discussions around, we can't all be together. Let's spread out. Let's go sit over in other spaces. I think that also relates to some trauma that we have. But we'll talk about trauma in a few, but thank you for sharing that. Betty.
Hi. Yes. Yes, I would like to share about my experience. I grew up in the South, in Arkansas, small town in Arkansas. And when I was 18, I came to California on a train to live with my family in California. But when I was on the train traveling, coming to California, I remembered and I grew up in segregation. So I went to an all-Black school, lived on the other side of the tracks and all of those things. But my most horrible experience when I was on the train, a young child, looked like probably 4 or 5, I don't know, maybe older. But when she looked at me and horrified, and she said, Mommy, look, a nigger. And it was shocking to me, and I was so embarrassed. And anyway, that was my first big experience.
Yeah.
Just want to share.
No, I appreciate it.
There's a couple of other hands that just popped up too, but just I wanted to share a little perspective that in terminology, I'm just coming from my own lived experience here. As somebody who was growing up where I grew up, I was raised by a Black woman. I mean, and this is elementary school. I was always at their house. I didn't have much mentorship, so I was at my best friend's house like all the time. And growing up through junior high and just not having a mentorship, I was raised in the streets. I was always out there. The group of people that I was always with, they called me, my nickname was Snowflake. And it was my responsibility to go talk to the cops every time the cops showed up at the house. I was 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. And I was the one that was talking to the cops because they viewed me differently. And taking that with me as I grew older and older, it wasn't until I was in my early 30s when I was studying cultural anthropology that I realized that the same Black men that I was raised by they were feared by. And it finally made it make sense why I was that snowflake, why I was the one that was going to and it wasn't until I was 30, it was just so strange to see that dynamic. But it was something that I grew up in, and I learned as I was going through school that it was because my skin color is white that I can get into certain places and I can do certain things, and certain people will listen to me specifically because of that. And it just all came to me. So it's just strange. It's to see it now. A little bit there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, for sure.
Can I piggyback on this? At first, then when you raised the question, I thought, oh, it's a good dialogue. But hearing everybody talk about this, I'm white, so it took a lot longer for me to learn that there were privileges that came with it. And I think you know, I was a lot older than most people were, or people of color were. And I'm like, oh, doesn't this relate to what we're doing right now? I still have to be educated. And I think that's the beauty of these presentations and these workshops. I still have to be educated, and I'm trying to educate my children, but I'm just trying to thank you for I'm thanking you for the question. Because at first I was like, oh, this will be fast. But I'm like, it relates to it. We're always learning. So thanks.
You know, absolutely. I think this goes back to Peter's point. In the beginning, you know, Peter, you expressed you want to gain an understanding in a sense of where people are really coming from, and how to better understand how to respond to this type of stuff. I want to also make sure we get to Michael and Juno. So Michael, you're up.
All right. I was raised in a primarily more urban area. I was the minority as a white person in all of my schools. So I didn't really experience any racism at that point. In my high school year, I transferred to a different area where everybody who was Black sat at one table. I came from a different culture. And so I was instantly labeled as what they would call a wigger. It was like a white,
yep.
You know,
yep.
That's what I was.
Yep.
I was bullied. I was beat up. So I experienced, I feel like it's racism. I experienced the racism from that perspective. So I just wanted to tell that story also.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Michael. Juno and then Genesis, you can take us to where we're headed next. I think terminology is really important here. And Michael, I appreciate you for not saying the word, because but wigger, if you don't know, Google it. You better ask somebody is what I would say. But I appreciate that. Juno, you're up.
Hi, I think it's really interesting, Michael, you just shared, because I had very similar but kind of opposite experiences. I went to, I'm mixed, Black and white, and I went to primarily white schools my whole life. I was most of the time the only, if like one of a handful of people of color in my school. And so I was very aware of my race very early because of my family. They made me aware that I was mixed very, very, early on, but also from my peers in elementary school. And then fast forward to high school was the same way. I went to a New England boarding school. And so I experienced a lot of heavy culture shock. I had to be explained to about why I was being made fun of and teased, because I didn't really understand it. And it was only after I experienced all that it clicked that it was what I was experiencing back in elementary school too, which was the racism. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out what it was. And that was kind of what it's been in my guilting me for a long time, is that I perpetuated some of these systems too. I was a part of that. And I was so young, I wasn't aware, but by being a part of that, I have to, work with that. But yeah, that's my experience.
And thank you for sharing that. I think one of the things that we understand as we move through this and go on this journey together, and we have a few more sessions, is that there's so much more that we need to do, right? And so as we begin to round out where we go and what we do next, the question that I have for each of you to think about and take a moment and be really reflective in this moment and think about, how might you begin to embed race, equity, and equitable practices within your personal and professional networks based on what you have learned today. And we want to create an intentional space for you to reflect and really think about. You've gotten all this information around institutional racism, systemic racism, interpersonal. What are you going to do with it now, right? Because I like to share that knowledge gained and not shared is knowledge wasted. So what are you going to do with the things that you learned today and begin to use them in your personal and professional networks to disrupt and interrupt things those disparities that you may see, to call people in or call it out, What are you going to do? And we're going to open up the space. If you would like to share, please feel free to unmute. And if not, if you want to put it in the chat or even hold yourself accountable and send it to us personally, where it's just something that you send to us, you may do that as well. So what are you going to do? How might you begin to embed race, equity, and equitable practices within your personal and professional networks based on what you have learned today?
Think about also your sphere of influence.
Hello. Hi, my name is Darlene.
Yeah, hey.
What I'm gonna do to change is to teach the youth, for one, my own child and youth and younger family, younger people, our young generation, that it does not matter about color should never be an issue within life, regardless of where you come from, where you are, what you have, and what you gained or what you grew into, what you were born into in this world, because that doesn't mean anything. The richest person is the saddest person, and the most brokest, humblest person is the happiest person in the world. So teaching our youth and our younger generation how to go forth and set boundaries as far as when you come into situations within racism. It's other ways to handle the situation besides getting ugly and being ignorant. And you can always walk away from a situation when it arises. That's for your safety and theirs. And also teaching our youth that it's not our fault for nothing that we were born into. It's not our fault for the color of their skin. And it's not our fault for the way the world is, because it was taught like that. No one is born that way. It was taught that way. And to just make sure that they can open their minds, have an open heart, have an open mind, in a broader perspective, and put life in front of them with all eyes open, using your third eye, and have color. It doesn't matter the color, just use color in everything you do. It should not matter the person's color of their skin. It shouldn't matter their occupancy, their handicap, whether they're handicapped, whether they're disabled. It doesn't matter. It should just be one human being, period. And just like when a baby is born to this world, they don't know. So just teaching our kids to know that being of a descent from either outside of the United States or in the United States, it doesn't matter. Just learn how to grow, because you never know. Growing within your community can embrace your community and make your community even better with all generations born into it.
Thank you for sharing your truth, Irma. And I see Melissa has her hand up and Juno has her hand up as well. Melissa, if you can unmute.
There I am. I'm still learning this whole stuff on the phone, sorry. So I'm gonna talk about where I come from and how we were raised. So I'm originally from Hawaii. And within my family, we have African American, Caucasian, Japanese, Chinese. I mean, the list just keeps going. When my oldest daughter was about 5, she didn't know the difference between color or nationality or race or anything to that extent. Her best friend was half African American, half Caucasian. And when I asked her, I said, what nationality is your best friend? And you could see the wheel turning in her head. And she's like, human? And I was like, exactly. There is no difference, because at the end of the day, we are all the same. And it wasn't until she was about 13, I had come back to the mainland and she got onto the school bus and a little boy told her, "Where is your green card?" And she had never heard that before. And she was very upset. And she says, "Mom, what does that mean?" And I said, "Where did you?" I mean, I instantly got upset. I was like, "Where did you hear that from?" And I said, "No, it doesn't pertain to you. You were born in the US, you know, sometimes you're going to come across that. But, you know, in Hawaii, we bring all these different nationalities to the table and we put it all into one bag and we shake them up and out pops this beautiful child. And that's how we raise our children. And, you know, I come from a very large family. And when you get us together at a reunion, it seriously looks like the meeting of the United Nations. You have blonde hair, blue eyes, Japanese face. You know, I have cousins that were born and raised in Germany, you know, that have the German accent, but, you know, they are a part of my family. And that's how we raise our children. You know, I heard somebody talk about the not knowing about the history of African Americans. And for me personally, I'm a history buff. So I wasn't allowed per se to take American history as a requirement in Hawaii. We were taught to take Hawaiian history, and American history was an elective. So of course, you know, I took American history as the elective, and you know, my stepmother was African American, my grandparents were, and the history that I learned just by listening to their history. That's where I got my information from. Yes, books are great, but when you can hear it word of mouth and you can hear the what's the word? The trauma behind their lives growing up through the Depression, through segregation, and you could feel it within yourself, and you take it and you run with it. You're like, this is what I want to teach my children. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. Treat me the way you want to be treated. But I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I see we have some other comments in the chat. Committing to educating yourself and learning, committed myself to educating other white folks about Black America, addressing white fragility. Also, when it's time for Delta Peers to be a nonprofit for our county, agreeing that as a group of peer specialists to specifically seek Black women for the executive director position. Thank you for sharing that. There's been many instances where I was overlooked because of my skin, being too dark in the white community and the Black community, figuring out where I fit in, continue to speak up to other white people about racism, white supremacy, and internalized superiority. And then just sharing, oh, that was Nastasia saying that it is possible. And so we want to thank you today for really making a space and just give you some next steps to see if there are any other comments or thoughts around what are some things you want to learn in the next session as we continue on this journey together. Please feel free to drop that in the chat. Nastasia and I are grateful for sharing time and space and energy with you today, and understand that it's about the journey, right? We're going on this process together, and we ask that every time you come into this space, you come willing and open to not only just learn, but to bring your full self to this work. And so even though if you did not choose to answer the question, I really hope that you take the moment after you hit the end button from the training today and you leave and think about your role in it, because each of us have a role to play, and your role is just as significant as the next person's role. But what will you do with what you learned today to move race equity forward? Not tomorrow, not the next day. I'm talking about the next hour, the next 30 minutes. What are you going to do to make sure that you personally not make it a momentary checkbox, but you make advancing race equity a life box? And that's how we begin to create change. That's how we interrupt systems. That's how we disrupt and dismantle racism. And so I want to say thank you again for allowing us to have an impact on your journey. I'm going to turn it over to Nastasia for closing remarks, and we want to thank you again.
Those were beautiful closing remarks. There's nothing I can do to follow that. That was powerful. We should have released folks after that. I just want to give folks a heads up that our next session will be held on August 23rd. Erica, Jamie, back me up on this one. August, 23rd will be our next session, our third session, same time, same place. We have an amazing group of facilitators. So you may see Monique come back to this space. You may see me come back to this space. We'll leave that up to the interpretation of the team. But again, like Monique said, as we depart today, continue to use your influence to move this work forward. We appreciate you. It is 6:01 on the dot here. So you know what? Enjoy your day, enjoy your evening, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.